everyone, welcome back to the Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. This is Patricia. How are you doing? I've been doing okay. I hope you've been doing well. Missed you last week. Some of you reached out to ask where last week's episode was. Thank you for asking. I wish I could have a better explanation than the one that I'm going to spend the next hour trying to explain. But really, I mean, you could probably guess from the title of this week's episode, it's been a hard week. It's been a hard 3 weeks. For those of you not in on the joke, this is part of a running series that I started quite a few episodes ago, back on episode 7, called It's Been a Hard Week, where really, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. Teaching is hard, and being around vulnerable people is hard. And this is just kind of a space to talk about that a little bit. And so, yeah, the past 3 weeks was hard. And I've never had, when I started this podcast, I think like a lot of people who start podcasts do, I worried a lot about like posting consistency and whether or not I would be up to the task of generating a new episode every single week, sitting down and recording for 1 hour every single week. And I'm actually really surprised at myself that I've been able to keep that up for 16 episodes, 17 straight weeks in a row. And this was amidst quite a bit of traveling, grad school applications, being involved in a bunch of things. So I'm trying to give myself a little bit of credit for not messing up, so to speak, until now. Yeah, I just wanted to apologize for letting that slip last week. I will tell you that it didn't come without a fair attempt at getting an episode out on time. I can't tell you the amount of times I sat down in front of this microphone to try to record the episode that was supposed to come out last week and just could not come out with anything. I think the only real explanation or only real description of what was going on was like it felt like my brain was broken, that like everything I was saying I was just constantly hitting re-record because nothing made sense. It was just one of those weeks. And I mean, you know, it's not just that's been an indication that things have been tough. Like I've been stress eating like crazy. Like my skin is a wreck. My sleep schedule is just all out of whack. It's just, you know, something like times like that in life happen. And it's frustrating because you feel like so much of the reason why you're feeling so crummy isn't necessarily having anything to do with anything that's going on around you. But it just feels like you're just not handling life the way that you're usually, you know, able to. Like it just really felt like my brain was broken for 3 weeks, and sometimes less broken than others. But I will tell you that I accomplished something very monumental about 2 weeks ago, 6 years into my career, and I'm actually surprised it took me this long, but reached a major milestone as a teacher, and that was I broke down crying in my own classroom for the first time two Mondays ago. Now, this was not during the school day. This was not in front of students, although 2 students did walk into my classroom while this was happening, which was incredibly embarrassing. But yeah, it like came to that point. I feel like a lot of teachers probably hit this not 6 years into their career, but like 6 days. I'm really shocked and like kind of, pleasantly surprised at myself that it took me 6 years. But yeah, I reached that point in my career where I just could do nothing else. I was just sat in my classroom and cried, and it wasn't, and the thing is that like, it's not as if anything like awful had happened to me all at once. This isn't like, usually you hear about these stories when like, you know, students are like super mean to their teachers or like administration is super mean or whatever. But really, as I'm thinking back on it, it was really like, you know, an accumulation of things. So the reason for it, without going into too much detail, it really did not have anything to do directly with, you know, the classroom or my teaching or my classes, but it was a situation where like a project that I was in charge of kind of broke down due to factors and sudden changes to the project that were totally out of my control. I think anyone looking at that situation would see it as kind of like a quote unquote like nobody's fault situation, but me being who I am, whenever stuff like that happens, my first instinct is to go and find out if there was something that I could have done to prevent it from happening. You know, and if you think hard enough about something, of course there's something, right? It's like this, you know, your greatest sin is being unable to accurately predict the future. The more I thought about it, the more I realized, there was something I could have done. And the more I thought about it, the more guilty I felt about it, and the more responsible I felt for just, things not working out. And, it was like there was one thing I could have done that could have prevented this, and I didn't do it. It was an oversight. I thought about it, didn't do it, because I didn't think it would make sense at the time. And if I had theoretically done that one thing, then maybe things wouldn't fall apart this way, right? And this isn't like, what's funny is that this isn't like the only time this has happened. I'm realizing that there are lots and lots of times in my life, particularly in my career, where, I'm in charge of a project and things don't pan out exactly the way that they were supposed to, and there are costs associated with that. And my first instinct is to just go and try to take responsibility, figure out what I ought to take responsibility for. And oftentimes, what I conclude is like, well, I should take responsibility for everything because everything's my fault. I have this thing where I feel like personally responsible for things that are actually totally out of my control. And I carry a lot of guilt with that. And so the root cause of me like having this massive breakdown in my classroom 2 weeks ago isn't, again, it's not anything to do with like the class, like, the typical, like whatever image you have of your head of like, kids being rowdy and wild and disrespectful and this like, poor young teacher crying in the front. It's not that. It was like, just I think something that maybe a lot of particularly young, inexperienced, if I could say that, people like myself maybe deal with. Maybe some deal with it less than others. If you're more, I don't know, emotionally stable, maybe this is not as much an issue. But I'm realizing through the past couple of weeks that I have this habit of taking on responsibility and guilt and wrongdoing that might not all belong to me. And so I don't know, this got me thinking, because I think most everyone knows and acknowledges that teachers have stressful jobs. And I think a lot of people who are outside of the teaching world, like understanding that, they try to devise ways to make things less stressful for teachers, whether that be kind of like increasing, throwing money at it, right? Like, just as long as we have more funding for schools, then teachers will not be as burnt out and tired and have such awful personal lives. Or like, I don't know, like just go on like, those crowdfunding pages where you can like buy a library for a teacher who's asking it because like, schools don't fund that. Well-meaning people understand that teaching demands a lot. But really, given my experiences at a school where I feel like, resource-wise, I'm relatively well-resourced. There's nothing like materially that I have asked for that I haven't been able to really get, right? Within reason. And yet I still feel like the beginning throes of that burnout, or at the very least, like stress, right? And I think universally, whether you're from a well-funded school that's like kind of this utopia or whatever, or the least well-funded school, I think one of the main reasons for this burnout and stress really comes down to that one thing that I mentioned before, the fact that I feel teachers feel like they are, are at times made to feel like they are responsible and culpable, or even at fault for everything within their arm's reach, right? And perhaps more importantly, that responsibility usually ends up resting on the shoulders of individuals, like that one teacher, rather than like teams or institutions or groups. And that last part I actually found, to be really, really true, if only because, I said before that, like, the situation that had me breaking down my classroom happened once, and then it happened kind of again recently. But the reason why that situation didn't have me breaking down in tears was really because I didn't tell him that I was going to mention this on this podcast, but my principal found out that I just had a total breakdown after that event, and without really even saying anything, he has been stepping in to help me with a lot of things, and which on the one hand has made me feel, number one, like I can't be more grateful. Like, people say all the time, all this, have so much crap to say about their administrators and whatever, and bureaucracy, but my administration at my school has been nothing less than amazing. And so for him to basically take on my problems and make it his, it's just, that's so rare to say. And that's something I'm learning from as well. I just think that's so incredible. But really, that's one thing. But like on the other hand, a part of me was like, oh man, am I like so incompetent that I wasn't able to do this myself? Like, did I just prove to my principal that I can't handle things on my own? Like, and I feel like you can definitely like right away see the illogic in that, right? Like, because really the project that I'm working on is something that like started off as something that I could do on my own. And then it just grew and grew and grew and grew to something that like really should be a multi-person job, and it's still a one-person job. And so, for my principal to step in like that again, like, administration principals have, especially at a school like ours, where like our administration they teach classes regularly. And it's something that like I kept thinking, man, he doesn't have to do this. There are so many other things that he is concerned about, should be worrying about. And for me, this project is like, 40% of my energy right now as a human being. And so, but what I realized was that like, the difference between that first experience where I was handling everything by myself versus now having my principal who was like co-organizing with me, has made all the difference. And it's just like that stress decreases by so much once you disperse it amongst multiple people. I feel like that's so obvious. But I mean, think about the classroom situation, right? Unless you're maybe an elementary teacher where you have a teacher's aide, and even then it's a different situation. But like, the whole structure of like a classroom is one where one adult is responsible for like 15 to 20 to 25 to sometimes 30 students, right? One person carries the burden of so many individuals. It's always like, like even in situations where you're co-teaching a class, it's like, it's hard, right? And then there's something, anyway, what I'm saying is that like, in teaching, there is something very individualistic about how you carry your burdens. And so I think I really grossly underestimated how heavy that burden, or rather like how much that burden is not designed to be carried by just one person. And yet so much of how we frame education and teaching puts the expectation on teachers to be able to carry that burden alone. I don't really think that's something that is encouraged at the very least, or is really done in many other industries. Usually you have, teams working on projects rather than one person playing 17 roles at once. And I find myself doing that a whole lot. And I don't think I'm alone in that, in teacher world. And so that's something that, anyway, was just brought to my attention as I was like angsting through this week. But anyway, I'm talking all about this and I'm just saying like teachers, are, suffering, whatever, everyone knows. But I think, those of you who are teachers, if you have input on this, please, let's talk. But if you don't, and you're not a teacher and you're just someone who knows that teachers are stressed out, but doesn't really understand what that actually looks like, and more importantly, how we can fix it, whether that be institutionally or, how to care for the teachers in your lives, how to love them. Let's talk a little bit about this week. Let's talk a little bit first about, exactly what this sense of responsibility actually looks like. Because I keep saying that, and I used this project that I'm working on as an example, but really this extends to a whole host of things. So let's talk a little bit about that responsibility. I think, for starters, a lot of that responsibility, why that responsibility oftentimes feels more negative than positive, is, I think maybe this is more for younger teachers, or more like teachers who are just, I'm talking about myself, but like people who are just starting out in the profession. It's perhaps due to like imposter syndrome, right? Like, you're not sure, it's like you have this, you're faced with this stress and it's like just a lot of work and there's so much to consider. But on the other hand, you're thinking, am I really stressed out? Like, is what I'm faced with really worth me feeling this stressed, or am I just being a baby about it, right? I think about this all the time. This question actually arose when I was thinking of whether or not to do this episode in the first place. Just because, when you talk to teachers, you get a whole spectrum about how they view their workload and their stress management. Like on one hand, you'll hear teachers who talk about this job as if it's like hell on earth, right? Like it's making them depressed and miserable, and like they are ready to quit the next day. And then you have teachers who like talk about yeah, this is the easiest job ever and there's nothing negative about it. Like that spectrum is so wide. You have teachers who are like literally borderline suicidal with what they see in the classroom every day, and teachers who are just like, they pay me to do this. And I think a lot of that has to do with, first and foremost, your school, your teaching environment plays a huge role in this. But I think even so, especially for someone like me, where I knew I was walking to an independent school that, did things, it's still very much like a very, traditional school in the sense that like it has everything you would expect a school to have. But it wasn't like necessarily like a standardized sort of, teaching, learning culture in the same way that you might expect like a large public school to be, right? And so I didn't really know when I started teaching, I didn't really know what was considered too much and what was considered too little. And so you could say that for really the past 6 years, a lot of my like internal angsting and the reason why this imposter syndrome extended beyond just like, oh, I don't actually know if I'm qualified to be a teacher. This imposter syndrome of like, I don't know if I have the right to complain, right? The reason why I extended beyond that is because like, I just didn't know whether or not what I was experiencing was just really objectively stressful, or if, again, I was just being a baby about it, right? And so as I was thinking about whether or not I should do this episode in the first place, because like I don't want to run the risk of like, talking about all of this and saying like, yeah, I'm like super stressed, I'm crying in my classroom, and then objectively my situation compared to like other places or most other places is not that bad. That would look very foolish of me. But anyway, that was what was going through my mind. So I went ahead and I consulted the internet and I just Googled, right? This is very descriptive of the state of mind where my brain has been for the past 3 weeks. I just went and Googled teacher sense of responsibility, just on a whim, right? This is not a very, SEO sort of like optimized search phrase. But what I found was pages and pages of articles all discussing teacher burnout, the social burden associated with teaching, the social justice angle of everything, classroom management issues, like so many academic articles as well as scientific studies. I think actually that was like one of the first results but anyway, just Googling this very like blasé phrase resulted in just so many pieces of writing that talked exactly not just about teacher stress, but about how teachers feel responsible for things, responsible for, students' success, or more frequently responsible for students' failure, right? And so like, there's just so many stories and so many things that some of them didn't necessarily resonate with me personally, just because a lot of them had to do, the most obvious examples always being students who come from really, economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And there's just so much that is literally out of the teacher's control because of, I don't know, just poverty issues. And even then, right, teachers feel responsible for that, right? This is the reason why teachers routinely will keep granola bars in their desk drawers so that students who come in without eating breakfast will have something to eat before class, right? No one's asking the teacher to do that, but I feel like, that's kind of like that, that kind of is symptomatic of this psyche that teachers feel like if there's something that we can do to help a child's experience, then we are feel almost obligated to do that, right? And oftentimes that obligation and willingness sometimes can be the same thing. But I think in times where it can often be blurred as well, the line between those two, because I think a lot of the times if you carry the banner of saying that as a teacher I am responsible for whether or not my students succeed or fail, then there are a lot of subsections to that where it's kind of well, in order for my students to succeed they need to have XYZ at their disposal, whether that be obviously the tools to generate that the work that they need to demonstrate that they've been learning, Or something like the child needs a pencil, right? So if they need pencils or supplies to succeed, then and it's my responsibility for the child to succeed, then I need to supply them with the pencils that they need to succeed. Like it's really easy to start kind of like see where that starts building down the tree, if you will, the logic tree. And so, yeah, I mean, I think for me, like my school feels easy compared to like all these other issues that you see. Like my class sizes, objectively, my class sizes are super small, right? 4 to 8. My largest is 16 kids. And that's actually like my easiest class, to be honest, just because I feel like a lot of like teaching methodology is geared towards larger classes. So I actually have an easier time with my bigger class. So I feel like, the imposter syndrome feels particularly real just because I know that objectively there are a lot of things in my favor. My administration is, like I said, awesome. And so it feels like I'm stressed out, but I feel like I've also been playing on easy mode. And so there's this looming fear that as I'm looking towards graduate school and then moving to, most likely public school in the future, or a larger private school, all I can think about is like, things are only going to get worse. Things are only going to get harder. And so, if you know that, don't be such a baby and suck it up. Because if you can't handle this school right now, you won't be able to handle anything in the future, right? Which is like, yeah, I know that's a super toxic way of thinking and very self-defeatist, but I want to be a realist with myself as well, right? Like, and again, maybe this goes back to like the millennial psychology I was talking about in the last installment of this back in episode 7, where it's kind of like, I do believe that millennials give ourselves a harder time in order to prove that we are, like to absolve ourselves of any sort of like accusation that we could be perceived as whiny or ungrateful. And so I feel like that's part of the reason why I tend to be very, very skeptical of myself. And unwilling to give myself a break, right? And so on that token, right? So like I'm angsting about this, right? But I also want myself, in order to like, counter that, I also find myself then constantly trying to self-validate that, despite this, right? I am good and capable and have it together. That despite like, the stress and the failures that I commit, right? The mistakes that I'm making, that there are still things that I have done and that I've done in the past and that I'm capable of doing that makes me objectively a capable person. Which sounds like, I don't know, if you know the Enneagram, that's like such a type 3 thing to do. I haven't actually, by the way, guys, for those of you who are into personality types, because we talked about Myers-Briggs in the last installment of this, I felt like I was a type 1 Enneagram for a long time, and now I'm like not so sure anymore. It's always like times of stress where I'm just like, I don't know who I am anymore. I need to go consult like personality tests so that, these social psychologists can tell me who I am. For those of you who are really into that sort of thing and have like ideas, I welcome them. Anyway, I found myself like realizing that I had this tendency, right? Like, because all throughout the last 3 weeks, on top of like my stressing, what else was I doing with my spare time? I was obsessively editing my LinkedIn profile. Not because I was looking for a job, right? I'm going to be in grad school for at least the next year. I found myself obsessively editing my LinkedIn profile, almost as if to kind of be like, this is what my professional accomplishments look like to the outside world. Like this is objectively, for someone who has never seen the actual real world chaos of my classroom and, and my life, this is what my accomplishments objectively look like, no one can it's not like, there's nothing on my resume or my LinkedIn profile that isn't true, right? I mean, if anything, it's almost like, too true. But it also just looks very, very polished, and it really looks like I know what I'm doing. And I found myself just kind of like digging into that and kind of like putting like curling up into a ball, and finding shelter in my LinkedIn profile, because I felt like I needed to counter this like deep sense of inadequacy I was feeling with all these mistakes and all this responsibility that I was like doing a bad job of shouldering, needing to counter that sense of inadequacy with this like, oh, but I know I'm good because my LinkedIn profile says so. And on top of that, as I was doing this, this is good news. I was accepted to 2 grad programs over the past month. Yeah, over the past month. Which is really, really good news. Neither of them are like, oh my gosh, like, but they're both programs that are quite good and that I wouldn't be mad to attend, which is awesome, but also caused me to like further retreat into that like self-validation bubble, again, as if to say to myself, well, at least someone thinks I'm good enough. I think one thing I'm kind of seeing as I'm talking about this is something that I actually noticed about myself when I was in college. And it's that like, a lot of this, like this unsureness, this needing to like find security in these things was that like there seems to be this like lack of an upper ceiling, right? You never know if what you are doing is sufficient, because you don't know what enough looks like, right? It's like, if the evidence of lack of sufficiency, like the evidence that you aren't doing good enough is things breaking down, or criticism or failure or rejection, or even like when things don't pan out exactly the way you want, if those are like the symptoms for you not being at your best, then, and if that's all you see, then you always feel like you're never at your best, right? And you always feel like you need to continually strive. I constantly dealt with this in college. Like I never knew whether or not I was studying enough, right? Like I mean, I went from a high school that was like pretty okay to a college that was incredibly high achieving and seemed full of students who just seemed very prepared to handle college level work, and I definitely was not. And so what happened was that I found myself like bombing a test or a paper, and then like working way over time to like, do my readings and study and whatever, do the absolute most, and then even despite that, continually failing, but then also seeing other students do way, way better, and like, and lots of students getting A's and all that. And so what went through my mind was like, well, obviously if they can do it and we're at the same school, then obviously I'm just not working hard enough. And so I never ever really knew what good enough was for me. And so I kept pushing myself to kind of like reach this ceiling that I could not see, but I knew had to be there because I saw other people achieving it, right? And so you're hearing this, right? And and I'm hearing this, and you're probably thinking like I am, like, well, this way of thinking is like insanity, right? When it comes to school, yeah, maybe like your GPA is on the line, but like, in terms of like a career, right? Unless, again, not that this should be the bar that like everyone kind of aspires to, but like unless you like really, really mess up, what's the worst that could happen, right? Like you get fired, right? And that's if you like really, really, really mess up. But in terms of like the working world, like, the things that you work on, no one, especially if you're a teacher who is working on projects on their own, no one cares as much as you do. So do yourself a favor and care less, right? I remember having a colleague telling me this before, and I was like, yeah, I know, right? Like, and I know maybe it's a personal tendency that I do care too much, but I also feel like, again, not to say that teachers are the exception to every rule, but I feel like if you're a teacher, it's really hard to, find much freedom in that piece of advice because, like I said before, teachers bear responsibility for failures that, lie outside of their control because they work with students. And, whether this is a social expectation or not, students' successes and failures are inextricably linked to their teachers, right? like for us individually, we take responsibility for our own job performance just like any other adult at any other job, but we also take responsibility for how our students do, right? And so on good days, right, when your students succeed, then those successes are attributed to you, right? And I think a lot of people think that the charm of teaching is getting to bask in those successes, and I won't lie, it's a great feeling. It's awesome. It's honestly what keeps me going. And I feel like I just read like a Reddit thread like a couple of days ago that literally said the same thing, right? Like most days in teaching, you're just kind of wanting to die a lot of the time. But when you get those moments that it's like that you see your students succeed and you're like, you can trace back as to how that happened because they were in your classroom. Yeah, that makes up for everything. Like, it's just like, it's a very like roller coastery sort of ride. But believe me when I say, it feels worth it. But what about like 99% of the rest of the time, right? Oftentimes it's the opposite. When students fail, their failures are traced back to you, right? And again, like if you're thinking about this from a regular rational person perspective, you'd be like, nah, like students are students, kids are kids, they're very volatile. You can't take responsibility for everything. They're going to do what you only can try your best. Yeah, I know. Right. But like, let's consider the dialogue, that happens around education. Right. And, before I was a teacher, I was so guilty of this as well. Right. You can arguably attribute every like social ill, every political issue, every kind of problem we have in the world where people are like, not behaving optimally, you could probably attribute all of that to like lack of proper education, right? It's so easy to kind of like not that education is used as like a scapegoat for society's problems, but it's a really easy kind of way to connect the dots. And so, and on top of that, like if you're connecting the dots in that way and you're someone who like had some negative experience with some teacher who was less than perfect, right? It's so easy to be like, man, if teachers just tried harder and did a better job at their job, then then our world wouldn't be falling to pieces, right? We can't deny that a lot of the narrative, a lot of the dialoguing that happens around education as a sort of like, ideology rather than a, actual boots to the ground sort of battlefield that school actually is. It oftentimes amounts to that. And we hear that as teachers, right? And we know that like, whether or not it's realistic, a lot of that expectation is placed squarely on our shoulders every day when we walk into the classroom. And so it's really hard to kind of believe the idea that we're not ultimately responsible for stuff about our students we can't control, because it really seems like even if we can't control those things, like we are expected to do so anyway, which I don't know how any of that will change, right? But like, it is what it is. And so now it's just a matter of how do we cope with it, right? So like teachers, again, we know this and we walk through each day bearing that burden, whether it's reasonable or not. If the students are unengaged and they're not learning or they're not performing the way that they're supposed to, everyone, including the teacher themselves, asks, what can the teacher do to fix this? Not necessarily what can the student do to fix this, because a lot of times, again, they're children, right? A lot of what happens in their lives is really out of their control. And so who's the adult in the room that could possibly fix things? It's the teacher, right? It's a natural assumption to make. It's one that like I said before, it's part and parcel to the, social dialogue concerning education. But like, again, visualize that burden of like 30 students' performance, their successes or their failures resting squarely on the shoulders of just one person. Right. Whether or not, and I mean, like you could cite multiple examples of, public policy where that exact visual image is validated and brought to life. Right. The idea of teachers' pay being determined by students' test scores. Right. It's not the teachers who's taking the test. It's other human beings who are taking the test, and yet their performance is directly tied to the teacher's responsibility. I think for me, like a more maybe fun, if you could call it that, fun manifestation of this is when I take kids on Model Congress conferences. I didn't expect for myself to feel this way until the moment came, but during Model Congress, right, like it's a competition in the sense that like there is like a best delegate or like honorable mentions awarded in every single committee. There's like 60 committees at any given conference, I think. There's a lot of committees, maybe less than that, I don't know. A lot of committees. And so as they're announcing the awards for each committee separately, I usually have at least one kid in every single one of those committees. Let me tell you that no one is more anxious than me during the entire awards ceremony. Like me, I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, literally shaking, anxious whether or not one of my kids will win an award. Because what's going through my head is like, it's really hard for me. This is very Tiger Mom-esque of me. But it's really hard for me to like kind of take on a posture that's kind of like, oh, if they win, they win. If they don't, they're still great. These awards are really subjective anyway. It doesn't really matter, et cetera, et cetera. But like what's going through my mind instead is I'm thinking, what could I have done if a kid doesn't win an award, right? What could I have done to coach them better? Am I doing enough, right? I'm not being paid much to do this model Congress thing, but my obligation isn't towards just earning my keep, right? It's making sure that all of my students succeed. And that is what causes me to I didn't realize how much that mattered to me, until I was there. And I realized that when a student didn't perform as well as I wanted to, I was disappointed, not in them, but really in myself, because, again, it was going back to the whole thing of could I have done more? Where is that upper ceiling? I can't see it, but I know I'm not there. So I need to work harder. Right. I feel like maybe this sort of this naive way of thinking, this admittedly very unhealthy way of thinking wears off when you get older and you just start caring less about things. But I'm just having a really hard time not caring, right? Again, maybe it's because I'm, a millennial who's trying to prove that I'm working really hard and that I have high standards for my work, and that I don't want anyone to be disappointed in me, maybe. But at the same time, I don't feel like I'm alone in this. I feel like a lot of folks who work with, again, vulnerable people in a field where there seem to be very high stakes feel this way. As I was kind of planning out this episode, I saw this video that was, I feel like it's not a new video, but it was kind of circulating around a couple of teacher groups that I'm a part of. It's a video by a doctor on YouTube, called Dr. Zubin Damania, known on YouTube as ZDoggMD, which is a great name. The title of the video is called "It's Not Burnout, It's Moral Injury." And I encourage you all to take a look at that right now because, or after this podcast, go watch the video after the podcast. It's a really good video. I don't know if this guy does other YouTube videos, on the regular, but basically he talks about how as doctors, doctors enter the medical profession, many of them with this idealized picture of well, I'm sacrificing literal decades of my life to school and residency and whatever, and to do this high stress, high stakes job. Why? Because I care about people. And I believe that what I do in medicine matters. But he's saying that doctors come in with that idealism and then they burn out so quickly, because they realize that the systems, the structures, the constraints they're working within do not align with the reason why they started doing medicine in the first place, right? And what he's talking about is obviously our healthcare system, the bureaucracy surrounding it, the fact that as a doctor, a lot of doctors can't feel like they oftentimes can't just do their job. They can't just help people because there's so much other stuff that is broken about the institutions in place that disallow them from doing their jobs. So I saw this floating around in a lot of teacher forums, and to be honest, my first gut reaction, which is a very unfair reaction, I'm realizing is yeah, but are teachers and doctors really on the same level of things? Doctor stress and teacher stress, are they really the same thing? And I realized as I thought that, I was okay, well, I mean, why is there a hierarchy of careers in the first place, right? Teachers are valuable, doctors are valuable. Literally every career on the planet holds equal weight and importance. And so let's not start this discussion by saying who has the right to complain about this and who doesn't, right? So I don't feel like that's a productive discussion to say that, like, well, teachers don't have it as bad as doctors, so they shouldn't be able to complain in the same way. Because I feel like regardless, right, that really comes down to, like, your own personal, I feel, bias. And again, as a person who, like, my initial reaction was very much like against my own interest as a teacher, I admit to this and I realize that, like, this is problematic. But like, let's dispose of the discussion where we're saying that, like, this career has more of a right to complain than another because this career is more valuable or prestigious. It's not a productive discussion to really be engaging in. So anyway, the way that Dr. Domenio really framed this was that, again, as the title of the video suggests, what we often describe as being burnout is not that, because calling it burnout really just puts the responsibility on the person who is trying to honestly do good work, right? And basically says that, like, oh, you can't handle it, right? You're burnt out. And he says, really, this burnout is just moral injury, which is what happens when, again, you come in with a certain set of expectations about what the purpose of your job is, and then you constantly find yourself at odds with having to have your ideology, having to have your morals constantly contradicted. I'm not sure. It's been a while since I watched the video, and it's like one of those things where, as he was talking about it, even though he was talking about it within the context of medicine, it's something that I instantly understood what he was talking about, right? And but it's just a little bit hard to like describe, in the sense that, like, it's kind of like you have a certain, like, things, that things should work out a certain way because it's the right way for things to do, like, right way for things to happen, right? It's the morally correct way for things to happen. And then as you're trying to carry out that goal, there are things that are decidedly immoral or amoral that contradict that, and you find yourself having to kind of make compromises to a mission that really seems too important to be compromised in order to get stuff done. I don't know if I'm doing a good enough job explaining this either, but put very crudely, it just kind of feels like, on a moral level, you just kind of lose faith in humanity a little bit every single time you try. Because, like, it's one of those things where, like, you try something out and you're like, this is supposed to work out because it's the right thing to do, and then you realize, in fact, that, like, the rules are the exact opposite of how things are supposed to work out, and you have to play by those rules instead. Yeah, so I don't know. I encourage you all to go and, like, watch that video. I think a lot of teachers who face far more institutional obstacles and barriers than I do, particularly those regarding, social inequality, poverty, districts and an administration that are overly bureaucratic and oppressive in some ways and do not work in the best interest of the students. Those issues are rampant in education systems everywhere. I found a lot of teachers who are working in those environments had a lot to say about that. But I think on a broader level, you could probably see that in a lot of places in teaching, really, because it kind of, again, that moral burden kind of goes back again to, like, this idea that as a teacher, you really just feel responsible for making things right. And there's just a lot of things that get in the way of making sure that things end up the right way, right? And those things are oftentimes out of your control, but because, again, if the core of what you do is doing the right thing, then it seems like everything that is the wrong thing ends up being your burden to fix. Anyway, as I was thinking about this, I was also realizing that, like, going back to this whole, like, why do I feel this immense sense of responsibility for things that are out of my control? And I'm like, well, duh, because women and people of color have always taken responsibility for things that are out of their control. Like, women, for one, right, are socialized to take emotional responsibility for others, right? We're taught to be considerate of other people. We're taught to be as pleasing to others and, inoffensive to others as possible. Women and girls are socialized so that our job is to make other people happy. Women are socialized to be problem fixers, right? The typical, like, that's what moms do or whatever, right? And so, kind of like, I'll take the blame for this problem so that you don't have to worry about it. this is a point for a debate maybe in another arena, but I think on the whole, the way that women and girls are kind of taught to behave, there is this sense that like is ingrained with us that says that like, if we come across a problem and there's something we can do to kind of like mitigate it, then it is our responsibility to make it less of a problem for other people. And really what's happening when women do this is that we're shrinking ourselves. While making our wants and our needs less significant so that the group will benefit. And one might argue that like, society won't function unless, there are certain people who are self-sacrificial in that manner, right? But on the other hand, like, man, what an unrealistic expectation for people. And yet it's like ingrained in me. I don't think of myself as a, again, going back to the Enneagram, I'm not really that much of a type 2. A lot of people say that like a lot of women mistype themselves. Type 2s on the Enneagram, by the way, again, not an expert on the Enneagram, but Enneagram type 2s are said to be like the helpful types, and it's said a lot of women tend to mistype themselves as a 2 because of how women are socialized, and that we grow up with the expectation that we will be helpful and serve at service to other people, but really what that looks like is just taking responsibility for things that we are not responsible for. We are meant to not be obtrusive, to keep the peace and figure things out quietly. So there's that in the mix. When I realized that, I was like, oh yeah, maybe that's why I feel like, the need to, and why like, my male colleague can so easily say that I shouldn't have to take responsibility for other people's faults when I'm like, but I do, and why it was so hard for me to shake that. So there's that. And also people of color are socialized to believe that they don't deserve what they have and need to continuously earn the right to exist in a space by proving their worth. And this is particularly true if, I don't know, you're part of a group that has made an identity for themselves as the model minority, right? Again, this idea of like, we don't really belong in a place, right? And so, if there's a problem, it can't be attributed to us because that's a risk for us, because that's, people will find some way to point the blame on why we didn't deserve there to be. I'm saying all of this not, again, just to be clear, this is not in reference to my particular situation, but this is in reference to like just situations, broadly, where people of color, whether this happens in social circles as well. Like this is far more a universal sort of phenomena, than just one workplace, one school, whatever. And I think a lot of people who have not experienced this firsthand might find themselves feeling a little defensive at this because it does highlight an inherent inequality that happens within the same group of people, right? But as a person of color, as an Asian person, Asians being like the model, quote unquote, model minority in at least a lot of Western societies, there is this sense, right, that like, you have worked really, really hard to be considered on equal footing with white folks, but that place can be taken away from you at any time if you mess up, right? The only reason why you might feel respected or on the same level as a white person is because you worked really hard to get there. But once you reveal yourself as being less than worthy, then someone might say, oh, you weren't that good enough to begin with. You were a fraud. You didn't deserve this in the first place, right? And so it's kind of like you are on overdrive a lot of the time to kind of make sure that you are still secure in where you are at because there's a sense that like you didn't deserve to be there in the first place. I don't think this is restricted to Asian people. I feel like even, you might even say that other groups experience this far, far more significantly than Asians do. And so, I mean, this is where the whole thing about like, exceptionalism, Black exceptionalism, POC exceptionalism comes into play. The infamous line from Hamilton that says immigrants get the job done, which is such a powerful phrase because it's so true and it's heartbreakingly true because it's true, right? Immigrants do get the job done because that's how we kind of earn our right to be here, right? And then So being a woman, being a person of color, and then being a young person, not to harp on the millennial thing any more than I should, but I think there is this sense amongst people of my generation where we are so not used to the idea of being properly compensated for what we do. The whole like gig economy is such a great indicator of this. You'll hear from people a lot of times, I'm not being paid, not from young people, right? But like the phrase, I'm not being paid enough to do this, right? I feel like there's less and less young people who really are willing to say that out loud. It's more kind of like, instead of saying, I'm not being paid enough to do this, it's kind of like, I'm being paid to do this? You're going to give me money to do this? Wow, thanks. Which is so crazy if you think about it, because that really just means like we will settle for so little, And I don't think it's because young people are really that self-defeatist. But I really think it's kind of like we don't want to seem entitled because we wear that stereotype with us every day anyway. And so it's really, when a young person comes up and says, like, I'm not being paid enough to do XYZ, I'm not going to do that. Oh man, like it just opens up a whole can of worms for people to be like, in my day and age, like I'd be so grateful to blah, blah, blah. Like the jokes, the punchlines write themselves, you know what I mean? And so, all those three identities, right? And again, I'm not one to just be like, the only reason why, I want to be someone who takes responsibility for my own emotions. But it's important to be able to understand, like, the reasons why I might feel this way and others who are in the same kind of like career that, place professionally that I am, might not, is because there are things about me, my identity, the way I experience life that are fundamentally different from theirs. And that's not really a character flaw on my part. I think that's really important to understand. And so I think the reason why I mention all this is because, yeah, like, if you're experiencing this like crazy sense of like, why do I feel like I have to fix everything and I'm really like my mental health, my emotional health is suffering because of my inability to be the fixer, my inability to take responsibility for everything. But you're feeling overwhelmed by that and you don't understand why you can't just unload that burden onto someone else or just forget it. Consider what things about, what are the things that this society has been telling you about your identity that has built that expectation within you, right? Not to say that asking that question and answering that question really offers any tangible solutions, but if anything, it helps to kind of make it so you understand that it's not your fault, right? It's not a character flaw, right? All right. So saying all this, and for those of you who are not teachers and you're like, you feel for our suffering, thank you. But it's important to kind of offer up some solutions or some paths to solutions to this situation. And so I think if you're a teacher, and you're connecting with what you're hearing, I think what has been important for me is the thing that I mentioned at the top of this episode is, the way that I viewed my burdens and the way that I could, process all the challenges being put in front of me. To be honest, right, the project that I'm working on is very logistics heavy, very planning heavy, very just a lot of stuff that honestly requires a high level of organization that I've actually realized over the years I'm actually quite good at, which is very strange to me because I've never see myself as a very organized person, but this kind of like puzzle solving, logistics managing, I've realized that I actually enjoyed that quite a bit. But there is such a thing as having a logistics problem that is too large for one person to handle, and resources that are not just available to just one person. And so when my principal helped me step in, I'm realizing it's not because I was like incompetent at organizing things, right? But it was because I was trying to handle a project that's not meant for one person to handle, right? And so you can really apply that to so many things. I strongly believe, and I think there'll be a lot of people who disagree with me, that like teaching should not be happening in a bubble. And I am so guilty of this, right? Like I literally have colleagues who tell me that they never see me. Why? Because I spend all my time in my own classroom, and then like I stay at school after hours and then, alone working on my own thing. And part of this is because like I'm like my, one person sub department, like there's no one else who teaches Chinese at my school. So I do kind of feel like I'm cloistered by design. But through this experience, through my principal just like doing me such a solid and giving me help when I didn't know I needed it. It's so important that if you're teaching, to find a group or some form of support from other people, someone who is willing to shoulder that burden with you. If what we're talking about this week is that sense of responsibility, intangible or otherwise, that responsibility does not really ever go away, right? You can't really say, well, that's not my problem, right? I think that's something that like all teachers be really unwise for a teacher to really say that, like, I don't really care about the success of my students. They will do what with they're learning what they will, and I'm going to wash my hands of it. But really the key to it is finding people to help shoulder that burden with you. Again, be honest with yourself on when you needed that help, right? Like me confiding in my principal that I just had a total breakdown after that one project fell apart is the reason why he's helping me out now. And I mean, like, again, I don't expect for that to happen in every single situation, but like, don't think to yourself that having someone else to help shoulder that burden is massively inconveniencing them. Or even worse, going against the idea that you feel like you should be able to do this all by yourself, and that if you don't do it by yourself, then you're exposing yourself as being incapable or a fraud, right? We all need help. Teaching, being responsible for the lives and futures and successes of children is something that no one adult is strong enough to handle all on their own, right? Maybe at the end of the day, if you're a teacher, you're still going to be the only one standing up at the front of the classroom. But what goes on behind that shouldn't just be you either. And what goes on after that, right? The debriefing process, right? Like, if you just need someone to like vent to, like, that shouldn't just be you either. So this is really a piece of advice I'm trying to give myself, because again, like, I honestly still do believe that like where I have it at my school right now is pretty good. Things are going to get harder, and I need to be able to have the tools and the sensibility to be able to survive in those environments as well. So one thing that I saw, and something that I wanted to mention too about that is that, by offloading part of that burden to someone else, you will find that you finally have enough room to enjoy what you're doing. If you shouldering so much of that burden, that negative burden, sucks so much joy out of what you're doing. And if you continue to do that, even the kind of like the immense high from seeing student success will one day not be enough for you to counterbalance the weight that you're bearing every day. And so once someone else is there to help shoulder the burden, then you will have room in your heart to enjoy what you're doing. And that, again, is the reason for a lot of us, like the reason why we're able to keep going. And so preserve that place in your heart is what I'd say. Something I read in the myriad of articles, I'll link a couple of them in the show notes because some of them are very, very good. But one of the practical pieces of advice I saw in one of those articles was it said to be the best version of yourself, which I think at first read sounded very intimidating to me because it's like, I know for a fact that my best version can be really, really great sometimes. And also, like, it doesn't happen that often. And so I felt very burdened to kind of like, always be on all of the time. And I know that I was not on for a lot of the past 3 weeks. And so, but I think really what that piece of advice is saying is not necessarily that, but it's saying be the best version of yourself that you can be that day, right? And that's really all you can ask for yourself. And to be more clear, it's to go into class knowing that you will be the best version of yourself, and what you give of yourself that day is the best version of yourself, and to be satisfied in that, because what else would you be able to do otherwise, right? At the same time, though, right, I think one part of being able to do that is being able to leave your baggage at the door, which is something that I remember one of my teachers telling me. I had a relatively like non-tumultuous high school life, so I felt like this was not really a problem. But now that I'm a teacher, it's a problem for me all the time, and I see this as a problem for my students all the time. But leaving your baggage at the door and just keeping that space and that time sacred is important. All right. I think if you're not a teacher and you're thinking about like, well, what can we do as a society, culturally, institutionally to try to make teaching the classroom education a better place, I think one thing that definitely needs to go is this cultural and social expectation that teachers somehow make impossible things happen, right? That they're like magicians and that like they can turn, it's like life is a movie and teachers have this like ineffable power to kind of turn impossible situations into the best kind of situations. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but then you like see, the number of times I've heard people say like, I don't have a gift for teaching. And I'm just like, I don't either, but you learn how to do it, The idea of saying that like, people who teach have this, ineffable, intangible gift that, certain individuals are just blessed with. And it's like, I don't know, being able to like fold your tongue up into a 3-leaf clover or something. Like, it's not that. It's teachers are not magicians. I mentioned in episode 7 that I believe that teaching is magic. But teachers are not magicians, right? We bring students into the magic, and what our work is to inspire and equip students to take part in that magic, to play in it, to find a passion for it. But we're not directly responsible for how a child ends up in the future, right? Which sounds very like, I don't know, just very not responsible to say. But there's just so many things out of our control when it comes to that many different humans in a room at such a volatile age. Like, we are not the arbiters of children's destinies. There's so many things that are out of our control. And one thing that like, I've realized in the past couple of years is that like amongst kids these days, like learned helplessness is a huge problem. Hearing from students directly saying, quote, our teachers want us to fail is a problem, right? Not being able to troubleshoot or problem solve on their own is a problem. Blaming teachers for giving them, quote unquote, frustrating work because it's not as straightforward as they would like it to, that's all a problem. I'm not complaining. But there's a lot about, students that I feel like unless you've worked with that age group, you might be a little baffled at because, things that feel like common sense to adults, certainly, or even like, you could say to yourself, oh, when I was a kid, I never asked these kind of questions before. Yeah, me neither. Those are barriers. And so, there are certain things that you can kind of do to help a child kind of like, again, invite them into that magic and give them the tools to engage with it. But it's not as if like teachers can just like wave a wand and make them use those tools to the best of their, like, that's just not how teaching works. I mean, I don't think a lot of people are deluded enough to think that that is true, but you'd be surprised. And lastly, if you have a teacher in your life that you love, remind them every so often that they are good and capable, because there's a lot of things that happen in the classroom every day that kind of feel like the contrary a lot of the times. Value our work and our capabilities. Teachers have I'm not trying to flex, but like teachers have a wider skill set than just like lecturing, right? There's this like really awful but also really great meme that keeps going around that like says that like teachers are not just teachers, but they're also like nurses and counselors and psychiatrists and bus drivers and arts and crafts, mavens and all these things. And it's so easy to look at that meme and just roll your eyes and be like, oh man, self-important teachers being self-important again. But like, it's kind of true. Like, I didn't expect to be spending so many hours of my planning time, booking hotels and planning itineraries and managing budgets. This is a topic for like a whole other time. But like, being that teaching is not a super high, high paying job. I think there's like is the case for like any not super high paying job. We have this really false correlation between like your capability, your worth as a productive human, with your salary. And so the assumption is that if you're not paid too much, you're probably not that smart and not that capable. We do a lot of stuff that is not just lecturing. Please respect us for that. And And last but not least, what I'd say is, again, going back to the top of this episode when we mentioned that, most everyone knows that teaching is stressful and hard. I think one thing that if you really love a teacher in your life is to don't pity us and then leave us alone to struggle. Please listen to us and empathize with us on how much our jobs mean to us and why we care so much. But then after that, help us distract ourselves from our jobs every so often. Hugs are nice. Anyway, after 2 weeks of trying to get this episode off the ground, I tried my best, y'all. But anyway, I hope that if you found something in this worth sharing, please do so with the people in your lives, the teachers or non-teachers in your lives that you think might be interested. We're coming to the end of this first season of this podcast, which I'm excited about the fact that we've made it this far. Thank you so much for listening. It means the world. Anyway, to celebrate the end of this season, I'm going to be doing a special Ask Me Anything episode for next week. So, starting from whenever you're listening to this episode all the way until Saturday, February 22nd, you can go over to @BadChineseTeacher on Instagram or @BadChinesePod on Twitter and DM me all your questions. Anything is up for grabs, whether that be questions about learning Chinese, if you have specific grammar or vocabulary questions about Chinese that you've been having as a Chinese learner, feel free to ask those too. If you have questions about being Asian American, being Taiwanese American, being a millennial teacher, being, I don't know, a person who runs a podcast, literally anything, nothing is off limits. And so head on over to @BadChineseTeacher on Instagram or @BadChinesePod, or if you're on neither of those platforms, you want to reach me via email, you can email me at patricia@badchineseteacher.com. Send me your questions, y'all, and I will answer them on next week's episode in excruciating detail. Like I always do, I will give you way more information than you asked for. So send me those questions, yo. I look forward to reading them and answering them. Beyond that, there are still a couple more exciting things planned for the end of the season. And hey, even a couple of exciting things planned for immediately after this season. So you won't miss us too much. But if you haven't already, go ahead and follow us on social media @BadChineseTeacher on Instagram, @BadChinesePod on Twitter, and on Facebook, just search us up. And if you want to follow me, Patricia, you can follow me on Instagram @PatriciaLu, on Twitter @PatriciaSQLu, and you can read my latest writing at my blog at blog.patricialu.net. Show notes for this episode and all previous episodes can be found at badchineseteacher.com, where you can also drop me a note and a question if you would like. So that brings us to the end of this episode. I will see you all next week. Thanks for listening.